Just hours before the lights go out in Melbourne, a shocking rumor is spreading through the Formula One paddock. Adrian Newey may have just revealed the biggest weakness of Aston Martin's new car. And it is not speed. It is not strategy. It is something far more dangerous. Vibrations. During winter testing, the Aston Martin completed barely more than 100 laps. One race simulation with Fernando Alonso ended after only a short run. The car stopped. The garage went silent. And engineers began detecting abnormal vibration inside the hybrid system. If those vibrations returned during the race, the battery could fail. The hybrid power could shut down. And Aston Martin might not even see the checkered flag in the first Grand Prix of the season. But here is the twist almost nobody noticed. Adrian Newey also revealed that the car arriving in Australia is completely different from the one seen in testing. Different aerodynamics. Different bodywork. A machine still evolving just hours before the race begins. Which means the most ambitious design on the grid is about to face its first real test. 58 brutal laps. Heavy braking. Maximum hybrid deployment. And a car that engineers still do not fully understand. So the real question tonight is not who will win the Australian Grand Prix. The real question is this. Will the Aston Martin even finish it? Subscribe now, because what Adrian Newey actually revealed about this car changes the entire story. Right now the Formula One world is focused on one place. Melbourne. The Australian Grand Prix. The first race of the season. In just a few hours, the lights will go out, 20 cars will launch toward the first corner, and a brand new championship will officially begin. For most teams, this moment is full of excitement. Months of development finally face reality. Engineers finally see if the numbers from the wind tunnel match what happens on track. Drivers finally push the car to its true limit. But inside the Aston Martin garage, the atmosphere is very different. Because the team arriving in Australia is carrying one of the biggest question marks on the entire grid. And it all started during winter testing. While other teams were completing long runs and collecting thousands of kilometers of data, Aston Martin kept returning to the garage. Again. And again. And again. Mechanics removing bodywork. Engineers staring at telemetry screens. Conversations becoming quieter and more serious with every passing hour. Across the entire test program, the AMR26 barely completed more than 100 laps. In modern Formula One, that number is extremely low. Some teams completed more than double that distance. Which means they gathered crucial information. Tire degradation. Fuel consumption. Energy deployment. Race pace. Aston Martin did not. And that missing data is exactly what makes the situation so uncomfortable before the first race of the year. Because Albert Park is not a simple circuit. The track looks smooth on television. But inside the car, it is incredibly demanding. Heavy braking zones. Aggressive traction points. Long acceleration sections where the hybrid system works at maximum capacity. Every lap pushes the battery, the energy recovery systems, and the cooling architecture to their limits. And that brings us back to the problem that started everything. The vibrations. During one of the most important runs in Bahrain, Fernando Alonso began a race simulation. Fuel load high. Engineers ready to collect long-run data. Everything prepared to simulate a real Grand Prix distance. But the run never reached the distance it needed. The car suddenly stopped. The program ended. And the next day's schedule had to be completely reorganized. At first the explanation sounded simple. A reliability issue. But when engineers began analyzing the telemetry, they noticed something that immediately raised concern. Irregular vibration patterns inside the hybrid system. Small at first. Almost invisible in the early laps. But growing stronger as the run continued. That detail matters more than most people realize. Because vibration inside a modern Formula One hybrid system can be extremely dangerous. It does not destroy the car instantly. Instead, it damages the system slowly. Battery cells begin to suffer stress. Electrical components heat up. Energy deployment becomes unstable. And eventually the system shuts down. Which means the car simply cannot continue. This is exactly why engineers become nervous when vibration appears in the data. Because the problem rarely shows itself during short runs. It usually appears during long stints. Exactly the kind of running required to finish a Grand Prix. And Aston Martin never completed that distance during testing. Which means the team has arrived in Melbourne with a serious unknown. They still do not know if the car can survive a full race. And the reason this situation is even more complicated is something Adrian Newey himself admitted. The project started late. Development lost valuable time before testing even began. Which meant engineers were forced to accelerate the entire design process. And when that happens in Formula One, integration problems are almost inevitable. The engine must fit perfectly inside the chassis. The hybrid system must interact flawlessly with the cooling architecture. The gearbox structure must absorb enormous loads without transferring vibration through the car. If any of those elements are slightly misaligned, the entire machine begins to behave unpredictably. And some engineers inside the paddock believe that is exactly what Aston Martin is dealing with right now. But here is the twist that makes this situation even more fascinating. Because the car that struggled during testing may not even be the final version of the Aston Martin we will see in Australia. But the car Aston Martin tested during winter might not actually be the car we are about to see in Australia. And that detail changes the entire story. Because Adrian Newey quietly revealed something very unusual before the team arrived in Melbourne. The car used during the early shakedown and testing phases was not the final specification. In fact, he hinted that the Aston Martin appearing at the Australian Grand Prix would be very different from the one journalists saw earlier. Different aerodynamic surfaces, different bodywork, even adjustments in the way the power unit is integrated into the chassis. Now think about what that really means. Just hours before the first race of the season, Aston Martin may still be discovering how their own car behaves. And that is extremely rare in modern Formula One. Normally teams arrive at the first Grand Prix with thousands of kilometers of data. They know exactly how the car reacts with full fuel. They understand tire degradation. They have precise energy deployment maps. They know where the limits are. Aston Martin does not. Because every time the engineers tried to push the car further during testing, something interrupted the program. Mechanical problems, hybrid instability, and those strange vibrations appearing in the data. That is why some engineers inside the paddock are focusing on one specific area of the car. The integration between the Honda power unit and the chassis designed under Adrian Newey's direction. In Formula One, the engine is not simply placed inside the car. It is a structural element. It connects directly to the gearbox. It supports aerodynamic loads. And it transfers massive forces through the entire rear structure. If that connection is not perfectly balanced, vibration can travel through the entire car. From the engine block, into the hybrid system, through the battery, and into the chassis itself. When that happens, the damage is not always immediate. Sometimes it takes dozens of laps before the real consequences appear. Which is exactly why engineers were so concerned when the race simulation in Bahrain ended early. Because that simulation was supposed to answer the most important question of the entire winter. Can the car survive a full Grand Prix distance? Instead, it created an even bigger mystery. Now Aston Martin arrives in Melbourne without the one piece of information every team needs before the season begins. Confidence. And Albert Park is the worst possible place to discover weaknesses. The circuit looks smooth on television. But drivers know how demanding it actually is. Fast direction changes. Aggressive braking zones. Long acceleration sections that force the hybrid system to deploy energy again and again. Every lap stresses the battery. Every lap pushes the cooling system harder. Every lap increases the chance that vibration begins to build again inside the hybrid unit. That is why some engineers across the paddock are quietly watching the Aston Martin garage tonight. Not because they expect the car to be slow, but because they are waiting to see if the car can survive. And if the vibrations return during the race, the consequences could arrive very suddenly. A warning light, a drop in hybrid deployment, or a message over the radio telling the driver to reduce power immediately. But here is the twist most people are not talking about. Because despite all these concerns, several teams believe the Aston Martin might still be hiding something extremely dangerous. Something that could change the competitive order later in the season. And this is where the situation becomes even more complicated. Because despite the difficult winter testing, several engineers in the paddock are not dismissing the Aston Martin project. In fact, some of them are quietly worried about it. Not because of what the car is doing now, but because of what the car might become later in the season. Adrian Newey has always followed a very particular philosophy when designing a Formula One car. He does not start with a safe concept. He starts with a concept that has enormous potential. A design that might struggle early. A design that might confuse engineers at first. But once the team understands it, the performance ceiling becomes incredibly high. That philosophy is exactly what Aston Martin appears to have chosen. The AMR26 is one of the most visually unusual cars on the grid. The nose structure is wider than many rivals. The aerodynamic flow structures around the chassis follow a different path than several competing designs. And the rear suspension is extremely complex, something that rival engineers immediately noticed when the car first appeared. Those details suggest one thing very clearly. Newey did not design a conservative machine. He designed a radical one. And radical designs always follow the same pattern. The beginning is painful. reliability is fragile. Correlation between wind tunnel and real track data does not always match. Engineers spend weeks trying to understand how the car truly behaves. But if the concept works, the reward can be enormous. Some engineers describe this approach with a very specific term: delayed performance. The idea is simple. While other teams build cars that reach their peak early in the season, a radical concept continues unlocking performance month after month. By the middle of the year, the same car that struggled early can suddenly become one of the fastest machines on the grid. But there is a very dangerous risk in that strategy. Because the car must survive the early races. If reliability problems continue, development slows down dramatically. Instead of improving aerodynamics, engineers spend their time fixing mechanical failures. Instead of adding performance, they fight just to keep the car running. And this is exactly the crossroads Aston Martin may be facing right now. On one side, the possibility that Adrian Newey has created something extraordinary. A concept that simply needs time, data, and refinement. On the other side, a much darker possibility. That the integration between the Honda power unit and the chassis is creating a structural vibration problem that cannot be solved quickly. And if that second possibility is true, the Australian Grand Prix could expose it immediately. Because Albert Park is one of the first real endurance tests of the season. 58 laps. Heavy braking. Constant hybrid deployment. And a battery system under enormous stress. Which means the first race of the year might reveal something Aston Martin hoped would remain hidden a little longer. Whether the AMR26 is simply unfinished. Or whether the car is fighting a much deeper engineering problem. But there is one final detail that makes the situation even more dramatic. Because inside that green car sits one of the most experienced drivers in the history of Formula One. Fernando Alonso. And what Alonso experienced during testing may be the clearest warning sign of all.